In past weeks, I've shared with you a kind of characteristic of Mark and his writing and his gospel, that being that sometimes Mark does what some people call, he builds a Mark sandwich, a Markan sandwich. And what I've meant by that is that he begins one story like the bottom piece of bread, and then he lays, some peanut butter down, and then he'll come back and he'll put another piece of bread to kind of reconnect with that story. He does that several times throughout his gospel. And today, this morning, I kind of feel like he delivered up a double-decker sandwich. Okay, because what I mean by that is that you might remember that a few weeks ago, we looked at a passage of Jesus being rejected and dishonored as the prophet. And then he sent out his 12 and told them, you will be rejected. And when you are rejected, here's how you're to respond. And then Mark told us about John the Baptizer being rejected as the dishonored prophet. And now this morning, Mark is actually going to reach back and reconnect with the disciples, the apostles, the 12 being sent out. He's going to come back with the report of what they did. So if you can kind of visualize that, that's sort of Mark's double-decker sandwich. Some of you old-timers, do you remember that thing that used to come in to your house every day called a newspaper? Do you remember that? Okay, some of you young kids over here, I know that to you mean, that collage material, that craft paper that we get. Yeah, it actually has words and stuff on it. And for a long time, it had that, do you remember that comic strip where that guy, was his name Dagwood? Is that right? He would make these sandwiches? Okay. All right, good. So now here we are, Mark's, kind of channeling, I don't know, or Dagwood channeling Mark, I don't know. But here's his double-decker sandwich. Ooh, I should have left that one alone. That went too far afield. Sorry. The apostles. Their mission was, we kind of feel like, interrupted by the account of the prophet John being dishonored and rejected even unto death. And Mark, we talked about exactly why Mark did that. That was very important. The timing, the ordering of his wartime correspondence that he's writing back. And the apostles, as they are on their mission, they have received God's care, his compassionate care, but it has been mediated, it has been given through the hospitality of those that they went to preach to. Do you remember that? Don't take any staff, don't take any bread with you. When you go into a home, stay in that home. Stay in what they give you, eat what they provide for you. But today, in today's text, these same apostles who have been gone out and received that compassion through the mediated grace of God through others, they are now going to be tested in a very similar way. I just had a conversation with a friend this morning who was saying, I see a lot of testing going on when in the Bible. God brings people into relationship with one another to test both of them and their commitment and trust and faith. And that's very much what's happening here. Thank you for saying that to me this morning. I appreciate that. So with that in our minds and kind of set, I'd like to invite you to please stand with me as you're able to respect the reading of God's eternal word here as we see the life of Jesus shepherd from Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. I am going to, because of the length of this text this morning, I'm going to read and leave out a couple of verses, and I'll alert you to that as I read. But this is God's word for us today. Chapter 6, verse 30, the apostles returned to Jesus, and he told him, that is Jesus, all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Verse 34, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Verse 36, the disciples say to Jesus, send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? And he said to them, well, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said to him, 5 and 2 fish. And verse 41, continuing, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. And he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Our Father in heaven, miracle-working God, Yahweh, Jehovah, we bow before you and we bow before your authoritative word this morning. Oh, Father in heaven, we bow before you because you are King, creator and sustainer of all the universe, and even the atoms of the air which carry my voice upon it. You are sustaining them by your proactive will right now. And Father, we bow before your word in an act of submission to your truth as you are using your word to draw us to you in fellowship and right relationship. Teach us this morning, oh God. Teach us to be satisfied by Jesus. Teach us, oh God, to minister in that and through that and by that satisfaction today. Help us to follow the shepherd. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you please be seated? Last weekend, you might remember my family was actually away. If you were here last weekend, last Sunday, you'll remember that it was just me up here leading the singing. That's not the norm for those of you who might be watching or are new around here. That's not the norm. Normally, Tisa is here in her volunteer role, leading us into God's praise. But they were out of town, and my home has 5 young people in it and my wife, which basically, among other things, means I never get to watch what I want on TV. Okay? I think we all understand that. So last weekend when they were away, I got to watch what I wanted on TV. And I watched a fascinating documentary, which Tisa, will tell you. When Bill watches TV, the reason we don't let him choose is because he wants us to learn something. And we don't want that. So I got to watch a fascinating documentary on the grisly and necessarily brutal flock hunting tactics of New Zealand. Yes, what they lack in size, power, speed, or tooth and claw, the resourceful and independent New Zealand sheep makes up for with strategy and cunning. The flock works together to take down dangerous prey on the rolling hills of New Zealand, much larger than any one sheep, a prey that might otherwise escape, leaving their young hungry and vulnerable to the elements. While rarely individual sheep have been able to kill big prey, their advantage is in collaborating with their flock in the bloody hunt in order to provide for themselves and, more importantly, to satisfy the insatiable hunger of their lambs. All right. Obvious. Okay. So clearly, most of you who are still awake, thank you for the 80% who are still awake, you hear the sarcasm, the kind of the jest, not sarcasm, but the jest in that. Obviously, that's not sheep I'm describing, right? I've kind of substituted the word sheep in there for some predator hunting its prey. Well, that's not what sheep are like at all, are they? That doesn't sound like sheep. Sheep are not independent self-providers, right? They're not providing for their lambs by their cunning and strategy and intelligence and their own power, are they? No, they're not. And we'll see more of that laid out and unpacked for us by Jesus this morning in our text. Mark has been teaching us and is still teaching us who is Jesus, and subsequently, what does it mean to be Jesus' disciples? Who is the Messiah, and what does a disciple look like? This morning, to answer the first question, he is going to teach us that the shepherd satisfies his sheep. And you have to get your role in that truism very clear. Are you the shepherd? Are you the provider? Or are you satisfied to be the sheep? Well, let's see what Jesus and what Mark have to teach us this morning by showing us that very thing, the life of Jesus as the shepherd. One, in the first few verses, the sheep. Two, in the following verses, the strategy or strategies. And three, the satisfied. Sheep, strategy, and satisfied. Let's leap in here to this morning. In verses 30 through 34, Mark gives us a clear image of the sheep. You see, he begins in verse 30, and I'll say, when I first came to this text, that I kind of saw this almost as disjointed. It seemed like Mark had not, really done very well to connect verse 30 and 31 to the rest of the passage. It almost seemed just sort of like a bit of a sore thumb, a road bump in the story that he should be getting on with the 5,000 and their feeding. But the more that I read it, the more I recognized that that's not the case. You see, the apostles are Jesus' sheep, and they have now returned to the fold, and they report not their own dependency, not their own providence, not their own self-reliance, but they report not their fruitfulness, but their faithfulness to teach the good news. Did you catch that? Look at verse 30 again. It says that they came back to Jesus and reported or told him all that they had done and taught. What's the emphasis on? Clearly, it's on the teaching. I believe that when they say what they had done, it probably means miracles, right? Because that's what Jesus has been doing, teaching plus miracles to support and point to his teaching. I have authority to teach you. Let me show you in evidence by my miracles. He sends his apostles out to do the same thing, to get rid of demons and unclean spirits, but to teach the gospel. And it's that word, what they had taught, which kind of seems to be the most specific thing that they are spotlighting there. They come back and tell him what they have taught. And Mark paints the picture of these sheep, Jesus' sheep, being weary, doesn't he? They're frantic. They're busy. They've been running, we might say. They are even hungry, for they had neither the leisure, nor the time, nor the space to even eat, we are told. So, what does Jesus do? His heart is warmed toward them, isn't it? Can't you see that here where he says, come away by yourselves? Do you see that? He's saying, come be with me. That's exactly why he called them to begin with. If you remember, months ago in chapter 3, we saw that Jesus called the 12 apostles around him, and the text said, so that they might be with him. And now what is he doing? They've gone out and ministered. They come back tired and dirty and hungry and worn out. And what does he say? He says, come be with me. Come be with me. Come be with the shepherd, right? That's exactly what he's saying. And where does he intend to take them? Well, if you know anything about Jesus from the picture that Mark has been painting, then you know that he will probably take them to the wilderness. Because that's just the type of guy that Mark has been painting here, isn't it? Right? He's not up in some ivory tower. He's not in the Pharisees' lounge at the temple, right? He's out among the people. He's getting his hands dirty with the people. He's in a boat, right? He's fishing. He smells like the sheep. A shepherd smells like their sheep. And Jesus says, come be with me, and let's get away to the wilderness. Let's go out to the mountains. Let's go to a desolate place with each other. But as usual, in Mark's gospel, the crowd beats them there. The crowd, they can never get away from them, it seems. And yet Jesus, I think, with a glance over his shoulder at his 12 sheep, what does he do? He says, come, you two, come. The word says compassion. He had compassion on them. Now that's a difficult word in the English because we treat it like a noun. All right, Nathaniel, you're back in school. You're learning about nouns and verbs, so we're going to talk about that just for a minute here. In English, the word compassion looks like a noun, but actually the word that Mark wrote was a verb. It was kind of like, if we could, we might say, Jesus compassioned on them. You know, that sounds weird, but you get the idea, right? His heart was warmed toward them. As a matter of fact, the first word there, the original word there, compassion, actually has something to do with the guts. His guts were, he felt a gut pulling toward them, you might say, okay? And as a matter of fact, this verb of compassion here is only found in the Gospels. It's the only place that you will find the verb for compassion. And in the Gospels, when it's found in parables, it is always a picture of God, such as the compassion that the father of the prodigal son felt. And he runs out to meet his son and welcomes him in with an embrace and a robe and a ring. But when it's outside of the parables, it is always and only a description of Jesus. Jesus is the only one who enacts compassion in the New Testament. I read this great quote. I had to read it to you this morning out of the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It's kind of a thick book, but I thought that this was very helpful. Listen to what it says about this verb here. In each case, what we have is not so much the description of a human emotion as a messianic character. Compassion. He compassioned. Compassion. It is a messianic character. And he says that they are like sheep without a shepherd. They are like sheep without a shepherd. Now, most of you, from my silly illustration to begin, you already have been asking the question, what is a sheep like then? If it's not like that, I know that does not describe a sheep. What is a sheep like? It's dumb, right? It's needy, right? You're looking through Jesus' eyes at the crowd. They begin to break up and wander, right? Often, no, don't wander away. You just kind of see Jesus, keep them close, or they'll just kind of wander off and get into dangerous situations, prone to wander. Lord, I feel it, as the old hymn goes. As a matter of fact, this phrase, a sheep without a shepherd, this is actually directly from the Old Testament. If you read the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, you will read this phrase over and over again. And it always means people who have no leader, people who have a very poor leader. Someone who has abdicated their responsibilities, someone who has ignored those who they are supposed to be leading. The Old Testament calls them often sheep without a shepherd. And so when Jesus, full of compassion, in his very gut, he's warmed toward them. He sees them as an Old Testament prophet, like sheep, dumb and wandering, but with no leader. What does he do? What would you do? Jesus, I was pretty surprised to find that he taught them many things. That's not at all, I think, what we would probably do, right? That's not it. Jesus' priority is not, okay, 12 gather around, we need to start a clothes closet. Okay, 12 gather around, who's got an idea for a good soup kitchen? Where's the benevolence committee? Where's the compassion fund? These people are like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus' priority, Mark tells us again and again, his priority is on teaching. Just like his apostles came back and told their shepherd what they had taught, because that was the model that he gave them. First priority is to teach them. He wants to take care of their eternal satisfaction, even while he's concerned about their temporary and physical satisfaction as well. This is first, the word first. As a matter of fact, I just told you that the Old Testament has this idea of sheep without a shepherd in it many times. Let me show you one of those instances. In Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 15, it says, "And I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will feed you with knowledge and understanding." I wonder if Jesus was thinking about that from Jeremiah. Well, was he thinking that when he said, they're like sheep without a shepherd, I will give them knowledge and understanding. I will feed them and satisfy them with knowledge and understanding. He is the shepherd, and as we see here, God's compassionate shepherd satisfies his sheep, doesn't he? Are you satisfied this morning? Are you satisfied in him this morning? Right? I don't mean, kind of, well, are you just putting up with it? But I mean, are you satisfied with his loving kindness this morning? Oh, well, that's the teaching, but when it comes to the care, right? He doesn't ignore their physical concerns either. So when it comes to the care, when it comes to the ministry, when it comes to the feeding, how should they go about it? In other words, point 2, what strategy should the sheep use under the shepherd? Verses 35 through 38 talks very clearly of this. Jesus, you see, sent his apostles out totally dependent on God to supply their food and lodging. And Mark describes their current circumstances as gathering back to the shepherd with no rest, no lodging, and no, what? Food. And nothing to eat, but they are satisfied. Jesus satisfies his 12 apostles, first by saying, come away with me and what? Rest. Come away with the shepherd and rest and be at rest. Well, now what happens? The crowd comes, and just like the apostles, they are what? Harried, tired, the hour is late, and they have no food. Do you see what Mark is doing there? He's saying, just like we were, so now we saw they are. Just as Jesus had compassion on the 12 and said, rest and eat and rest and get kind of restored, now he turns his attention and says, look, the crowds are just like you. The crowds are just like you were. What then strategy will the apostles who were just in that condition, what strategy will they come to Jesus with? Their strategy is send them away from you. Send them away from you. Don't let them get close. Don't let them be a part of us. Send them away. Why, apostles? Peter, why do you want them to go away? So that they might provide themselves with something to eat. The apostles say, let the crowds go and satisfy their own needs. Let the crowds satisfy themselves. This is man's strategy, isn't it? What plan do I have? What strategy can I come up with? What power? Jesus immediately overwhelms their sense of sufficiency, of self-sufficiency, doesn't he? Verse 37, when they say, let them go away and buy their own food and satisfy themselves, Jesus, I think kind of with a chuckle in his voice says, why don't you feed them? You know? And the apostles, right, are stunned. What? Jesus, are you insane? Us feed them? That's what brings that sarcastic response. You know, some people don't think that there's humor in the Bible, but there is. And here we find it, right? John tells us that it's Philip, actually, who brings this point of sarcasm to Jesus. And here in Mark, it's recorded as, shall we spend what today would be, here in North Carolina, the equivalent of $25,600. Start, patting the pockets, boys. $25,600. Shall we come up with that? And we go and buy and we provide for them? I think maybe what Philip and the 12 apostles were expecting there was for Jesus to kind of get wide-eyed maybe and say, I didn't know that it would cost that much. I don't really know what was the apostles thinking Jesus' response was going to be when they said, shall we go and buy this much food for them? It must have been that they thought Jesus would say, oh, no, you're right. I wasn't thinking about the cost. Yeah, send them away. Your strategy is better than my strategy. Go ahead, send them away to satisfy and provide for themselves. And we might chuckle at that, but I think that we probably operate, and by we, I mean Open Door Baptist Church. I'm talking specifically us. What is our strategy when we are met with the impossible? I think that often our strategy is, let's think about this. $25,600, there's about 5,000 of them. If we take those 12 baskets over there and start passing them around, we might be able to collect, that's only about $5 per person, really. $5 per man, that's not too bad. Hey, listen, no miracle power needed. We've hit upon our strategy. Is that what we're like? I think we are kind of like that sometimes. We want to go to God and say, hey, thanks, we don't need your miracle power. We don't need to fall dependent at your feet. We don't need to feel desperate on you to solve this problem. No miracle power needed. We've got this. #Galilee strong. And we put that up on our website. #Galilee strong. We figured it out. No miracle power needed to get us out of this desperate situation. But instead, Jesus says, you feed them. They say, shall we feed them? And Jesus asks them, how many loaves do you have? Where's the center? Where's the center of this strategy? It's all on them. It's all on the 12. It's all on human power and ingenuity and strategy. He's setting them up. Do you get that? He's setting them up. He's overwhelming them on purpose. What he's saying is, see how much you can provide, and then I will show you how much God can provide. This is God's strategy, to overwhelm you until you are desperate. And then he will stand back and say, well, how did that go for you? Well, what do you think we might do instead? Oh, depend on my miracle working power? Good idea. Let's try that and see how that works. This is God's strategy. I think it's no coincidence that the amount of food that they have, 5 loaves and 2 fish, that seems to me that 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 broiled fish are probably just the right amount for 12. Don't you think? I think that the 12 could eat and be satisfied by 12 or by 5 loaves and 2 fish. In other words, that's probably why they want to send the crowd away. We only have enough to provide for ourselves. We can provide for ourselves with the help of this boy. We don't read about him in Mark, but he's there. Let's turn them away and look only inward at making sure that we're taken care of first. See, the shepherd's way is often to crush the sheep's way. Because the sheep's way is stupid. And his way is miraculous and glorifies his name and his name alone. You see, his way is to, we find next, point 3, satisfy. His way is to satisfy. His glory satisfies. His power satisfies. His authority satisfies. His teaching satisfies. Verses 39 through 44. Jesus, in verse 41, takes what they have and he looks up to heaven, from whence the manna fell, and he blesses the bread. He says a blessing in verse 41. This word blessing is actually where we get our word eulogy from. It's the same word. We just took it from Greek and we changed it into English, and it's a eulogy. He said a good word. And normally, the Jewish host at a feast or a banquet would say something like this. He would look down, first of all, not up, but down, and holding the meal, he would say, praise unto thee, O Lord, our King, O God of the world, who makes bread to come forth from the earth. Looking down, thanking God for the bread that comes from the earth. In the moment of miracle, Jesus looks up from where the manna came, and I imagine that he might have prayed maybe with his own words. Oh, Father, who is in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. And then he breaks and begins to distribute. And Jesus gives not to the crowd. Who does he give it to? The disciples. Thank you, Ruth. He gives it to the disciples to set before the people. In other words, he blesses this overwhelmed and under-resourced group of apostles to minister his grace to the flock of sheep. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? I hope you're asking that question in your life. If you call yourself a disciple, if you say, as we sang this morning, we will follow him where he leadeth, we will follow. If you consider yourself a follower, you should be asking, what does that mean, Mark? What are you going to teach me today? It means that you are a desperate, dishonored, rejected minister of God's grace. You're a minister of gospel power. That's what a disciple is. In verse 42, and they are satisfied. Such a beautiful and brief climactic word, as we've seen, that's just like Mark, to kind of get to the climax of the whole passage. And then he just gives us one little word, satisfied. That's what's at the top of this passage. That's the zenith, that's the pinnacle, that's the mountaintop of this passage. Satisfied. They were all satisfied. Jesus satisfies and more. He over-satisfies. He super-satisfies. You do not have a need or a want that Jesus cannot satisfy and more. And so they collect even the leftovers so that nothing will go to waste. Jesus' feast is the total opposite of Herod's elite and decadent banquet. There are no platters here. There are no nobles. There are no commanders. There are no leading men here, only sheep. And as I was reading this, I've already alluded to the fact that it sounds a lot like the Hebrews, the children of Israel in the wilderness, doesn't it? The manna, miraculous bread from heaven, right, being given to them. Listen to this very briefly. Let me just run through some reasons why we see Jesus rebuilding the kingdom of faith around himself as king, and now he's even taking them through the wilderness and supplying their every need. It's a retelling of the wilderness wandering. Numbers tells us that the great crowd of the Hebrews of Israel was desperate for water in chapter 20. God promises to satisfy them with water from a rock. Take a look at this. He tells Moses to talk to the rock before their eyes and it will yield its water, and you can give it to the desperate sheep to drink. Moses, on the other hand, dishonors God through a rash and self-reliant words. And what does he say to the people? Look at verse 10. He says, shall we? That's exactly what the apostles just said to Jesus. No, shall we provide for them? And what does Moses say to the sheep of his day in front of him? He says, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? Claiming for himself, right? This is his strategy. I will provide for you when God has said that he will provide. Well, because of this, Moses is actually barred from entering the promised land. Look at Numbers 27, verses 13 and 14. It says, because you rebelled, God talking to Moses, against my word in the wilderness, failing to uphold me as holy at the waters before their eyes, you may not enter the promised land. And Moses' only request, his only request to God in this moment is simply this, that God, Jehovah, Yahweh, will provide a leader so the crowd, chapter 27, verse 17, please give them someone who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep without a shepherd. Jesus, he is the new and better Moses, leading us through the wilderness and then satisfying us to the point that he can now release us to finally, right here, take this home with you, go and minister satisfied in God's compassionate shepherd. Family, friends, church, go out of these open doors. They swing outward so that we might go and minister the gospel of God's grace while we are satisfied in God's compassionate shepherd. Are you satisfied today? Do you know that God has given you a shepherd in Jesus. He took all of your sin on the cross and satisfied even the wrath of God, even the justice of the great and holy judge of all the universe. He satisfied on your behalf. Are you satisfied in him? Is God's requirement of righteousness satisfied through you in the person of Jesus? If not, do not leave this place unsatisfied today. If you would say, I am a disciple of Christ, then are you walking in being satisfied? Are you full and therefore able to minister to our community the grace of the gospel of God?